I find social insects to be absolutely fascinating. These insects will work together, each performing their own specialised roles for the good of the colony. They form what's called a superorganism, an organism consisting of many different organisms, and the superorganism can achieve some monumental things. Ants, for instance, have builders tending to the nest, scouts that seek out food, soldiers that protect the colony and raid the occasional termite nest, and even farmers that grow fungus and, believe it or not, keep certain other insects as cattle. I just find the whole thing utterly fascinating, and it's with a similar sense of fascination that I play Settlers 2. Because Settlers 2, as with the rest of the games in the series, is a game about creating your own superorganism. At its most basic level, it's a city builder, but it's far more nuanced than that. Settlers 2 isn't simply about building a city using a stock resource like money, like in the SimCity games. Rather, the prosperity of your settlement comes from an elaborate and interdependent supply chain that moves up through a hierarchy and then feeds back into itself. You build a superorganism. The storyline is pretty much a bunch of Romans in ships get swept off course by a storm and want to get back home, so they do this by building settlements. It's kind of silly, and you aren't likely to care about the story anyway. You play through a campaign of 10 missions, each lasting at least 1 hour, which, familiar to anyone who's played an RTS campaign before, is just a bunch of skirmish matches with basic objectives and a vague narrative tying it all together. I've played through the campaign twice before, once in the original Settlers 2 and once in this remake a few years ago. I haven't bothered to replay most of the campaign for this review because, honestly, it's just not worth my time. The thing is well presented with solid writing and good quality narration, but you could never play it and you wouldn't really be missing out on anything. You begin each game with a storehouse, which is where all your settlers, tools and foodstuffs are kept. The most basic resource is wood for buildings, so your first task is going to be to build a woodcutter to chop down the nearby trees and a sawmill to turn them into planks. But this isn't sustainable, so you are going to need a forester to plant new trees. You also need stone to build more advanced buildings, which means quarries, but this also isn't sustainable, and you're going to need to source additional stone with your geologist and eventually build a stone mine. But mining requires food, and for maximum efficiency you're going to need various types of food. This means fishermen to catch fish and hunters to hunt for meat, but these aren't sustainable either, which means you're going to want a pig farm. Pigs need water and grain, which means a well and a crop farm, and then you're going to need a slaughterhouse to turn the pigs into food. Your miners also like bread, which means a crop farm to grow grain, a mill to turn it into flour, and then a baker to finally turn it into bread. But now that you've got all of these buildings, your territory is pretty much full, and that means it's time to expand your borders, which you do by building and manning military buildings like watchtowers and barracks. But of course, it's not that simple. Recruiting soldiers requires weapons, which is another supply chain, this time involving mining coal and iron, which means a food supply chain to keep the miners working. But your soldiers also need beer, which is yet another supply chain, and you're also going to want gold coins to train them, which means a gold mine and a mint. Military expansion is both a means and an end, and you must seize control of enemy territory in order to win a game with the standard victory condition. But you must also expand to increase your means of production in order to facilitate expansion. Doing all this means juggling half a dozen different supply chains, and while the game may seem slow and lazy to look at it, a few wrong moves can leave your production stalled and your settlement stagnating while your enemies prosper. And this makes the game far more strategic than you may think. You connect all your buildings together with roads, and little settlers over whom you have no direct control stand on these roads and carry your resources back and forth automatically. As they can only carry so much, you have to be very careful with your road layouts. If you try to funnel too much stuff down the same few roads, things will start to get left sitting around because it's too much for your settlers to carry. You can order your settlers to prioritise the important stuff with a handy and easy to use snake chart, but ultimately no resource is unimportant, and stuff not being transported can have a knock-on effect that brings your settlement to its knees. Likewise, you won't want to limit production of a vital resource like wood to one small corner of your territory. Having to transport a whole bunch of wood all the way across the map every time you want to build some new buildings is going to place undue strain on your supply chain, and you'll find that you have to create small, self-contained supply chains of certain goods where possible. If you're building a mine, for instance, it makes good sense to build a farm, a well, a mill, a baker, a pig farm and a slaughterhouse nearby, as this will provide your miners with meat and bread with minimal strain on your transportation network. And it might also make sense to build an iron smelting factory, a metalworks, a smithy and a mint nearby too. And then with all of this growth in the region, it might be a good idea to build a forester, woodcutter and sawmill close by. What started out as building one mine has turned into a whole bunch of interconnected supply chains requiring over 10 different buildings and the all-important road network connecting them. Other city builders I've played have this same kind of basic concept, like for instance in SimCity you need to provide amenities and services for your people, but it's far more elaborate in Settlers 2, and most importantly, you actually see it in action in Settlers 2. You see the specific fruits of your labour as resources are carried back and forth and your superorganism thrives. It's totally cathartic and rewarding, not to mention hypnotic, to just sit and watch your little guys do what they do. Of course, if you're playing competitively, you won't really have all that much time to do that, especially when you're playing against another player. These settlers are cutthroat little bastards, and when they aren't carrying stuff back and forth, they're killing each other. You build military buildings to expand your territory, but you'll eventually find that your territory borders on that of an enemy's, and then the only way forwards for either side is to lock horns and see who wins. Fighting in Settlers 2 is kind of weird. To initiate combat, you click on an enemy's military building within range of your own troops and click to attack. Your men in range then walk over to the building, your enemies come out to meet them, and they all fight each other in a series of one-on-one battles. If you kill all the enemy soldiers, you occupy the military building you attacked and take a nice chunk of their territory, destroying all their buildings in range in the process. This one-on-one combat means that if you outnumber your enemy, your extra soldiers just stand around waiting until they have someone to partner with, which is just goofy. That's not to say superior numbers isn't useful, but it's superior training that really gets the job done. As your soldiers receive gold coins, they increase in rank. Higher ranked soldiers have more health and are generally better fighters. One general could fairly easily take on 4 or 5 privates, making your capacity to fight battles a direct consequence of how well trained and supplied your men are, and therefore a direct consequence of how good your general settlement is. So really, combat is an abstract representation of how good you are at the game. That's the only way to look at it, because otherwise the combat is pretty rubbish. Click a building and sit and watch them fight, or even worse, stand around doing nothing because you outnumber the enemy. The military stuff is annoyingly underdeveloped, and later games in the series expand the military side of the game, but some of the ones I've played go way too far with it, to the detriment of the settlement building aspect of the game, which is the whole point of the game. Settlers 2 has underdeveloped combat, but it does know that it's supposed to be a game about building a settlement, and it does that side of the game very well. As I said, the campaign is kind of rubbish, and it's the skirmish or multiplayer way you'll likely spend your time. There's a good selection of maps, and you can fiddle with a few variables, and you can pick from a few game modes. There's unlimited play, and then there are game modes where the winner is the first to expand to 3/4 of the map, to destroy all other settlements, or to be the first to mint 100 gold coins. The AI is really pretty good, and I'm actually still playing on the easiest out of 3 difficulty levels right now, but multiplayer is definitely the way to play this game. But I really don't think I could recommend it in good conscience as a multiplayer game unless you have a friend to play with. The game doesn't exactly have a big community, and although there are shorter maps for faster games, it's definitely way more time intensive than the 20-minute standard for RTS games. It's certainly a game you can play and enjoy in single player, but if you're interested in playing it online, I definitely recommend a companion. Visually, it's a very pretty game. The 10th Anniversary Edition is, if my memory serves me, identical to the original Settlers 2, except of course that it's built in a modern engine. I believe it's the Settlers 4 engine, but don't hold me to that. Whatever it is, it's really good looking. There are verdant meadows and trees softly swaying back and forth in the wind, while deer frolic around, and there's a lot of nice details in the textures. Your screen gets very busy, but the art style makes everything extremely distinguishable, and at no point will you ever find that the visuals or the interface get in your way of playing the game. The sound effects are also really great and very distinct, so you can tell easily what's happening just by listening. A sawmill makes a sawing sound, a mint makes a stamping sound, and so on. The presentation is pretty much flawless. So if I have to complain about the game, which I don't really want to do, it has rubbish combat and a rubbish campaign. But those issues aside, and they aren't really serious problems, this is a pretty fantastic game. The strategic depth of the gameplay is belied by the cartoony art style, and just looking at it, it may seem like a game that's easy to dismiss. But even though the original Settlers 2 is now 15 years old, this is a game well worth your time and money.